Alright, so you're looking to improve your cellular signal and you want to use a external antenna to get that or understand at least how much they can help you and figure out which one do you want to buy. So I have 5 different antennas here. Let's talk about the specs, how they perform. I'll do a speed test, and we'll look into a little bit of things that you really need to pay attention to before you go and invest in one of these antennas. Alright, a quick interruption to say this is Nate and this is the Nader Tater channel. And I wanted to let you know that this is actually my most expensive video I've ever made, and it's because I spent $1,000 to buy all those new antennas that you just saw on my desk. And it's been over 12 hours now since I started that filming. I've done all the testing all day long for hours on end, and I wanted to say that the video is going to be long because I'm going to cover lots of topics, but I am going to make it easy for you guys. I have it all in a chart format. I have graphs, I have PowerPoint I'm going to go through to really break down. I know a lot of you won't, hey, just tell me which one's the fastest, and it's just not that simple. So that's why I go through and explain what's different about the different results, and it depends on the band you're on, what type of signal you're going out, where you're placing this antenna, all that kind of stuff. So I will put chapters in the YouTube video so you can use the chapters if you want to skip ahead to a certain section, or you can watch along as we go through it, and I tried to explain it in a very clear but fairly technical manner. So to start with, I have the T-Mobile 5G 4x4 antenna that they sell with their gateway. I have a waveform 4x4, which has been my bread and butter, the one I use in my attic. I had to actually uninstall it to get it down here for this demonstration. And then I went and bought a Peplink 40G antenna. That's really more geared towards RV or Sprinter van types install. It's an omnidirectional one, but I get a lot of questions of should I get omnidirectional or should I get directional. The rest of these these bigger ones are directional antennas. And then I have 2 no-name brands that I got from Amazon, and that's really because I've been testing all my stuff with waveform 4x4. I also have waveform 2x2. But I've got some flack on my YouTube channel where people say, hey, you're a waveform lover, you must just be in bed with them and you don't care about any of these other antennas. And that's not the case, other than I do actually like their stuff. But because of that, I said, you know what, let me go out and finally test some of these other ones to prove people that I am unbiased. So I spent $1,000 on these 4 different antennas here, so I can do this comparison. This is not sponsored. I don't get any kickbacks from reviewing these. If you do click my links to Amazon and buy these, then yes, Amazon gives me a kickback, but nothing from the suppliers themselves. So let's go through a little bit of details. I'm going to try not to go too technical, but you do need to understand some of the technical aspects of the antenna to understand what you really need to buy and why it matters and what's the best for your specific situation. A lot of people ask me on the channel, hey, which one should I buy? And it's like, well, that's a loaded question. You really have to go into what are you trying to do, where are you going to install it, how are you going to use it, what do you connect to, which carrier and what bands do you connect to, and that's how you can really drive it. So what I want to first do is kind of go into the specs a little bit of these different devices. We can talk about the specs for these different brands and see how they compare. Alright, so to start with, I'm going to do this no-name rectangle one, and it's easy because there are no specs for it on their Amazon page. You have some pictures. It does basically include all the same components that the waveform kit includes, which means it has the antenna itself, it has the L bracket with a clamp, it has the mount, and it has cables that it runs from the antenna to your gateway. The components are lower quality. I'll get into that in a second here, but from the gain standpoint, it tells you in the description, it says it has 7.5 dB of gain, but that's all the information that it has. Let's go into why that is not a very clear statement. Alright, so next we'll do this square no-name one that's out there. Again, it has the same kit components, but it does actually have a spec sheet here, so this is a little bit more helpful. And that's where the top line there you can see it has the frequency range. So what you need to know is that an antenna does not cover the same gain, or it's not as good of an antenna across all different frequency range, which means all the different cellular bands, they have different frequencies that they perform in. There's pros and cons to that. But this one has 5 dB of gain, plus minus 5 it says, in the 600 megahertz range. So that's the T-Mobile N71 or 5G extended. If we go up to the 1700 to 2700 megahertz range, that's T-Mobile's N25 and N41 5G ultra capacity. So they get 7.5 dB gain there, so it's better. A higher number there is better gain at those higher frequencies. But then it tells you a little bit other details there, but those gains are the most important one. What it doesn't tell you is how much of a loss you get from their 30 feet of cabling, and that's something that we'll have to test out here versus the waveform one. So now let's look at this Peplink 40G antenna, and now so this one has 4x4 cellular, and then it has one GPS. You typically won't use the GPS for these gateways, but it does have that support. Now, this is where all the advertising is, so I tell you, you really need to look into it. And I'm not making fun of Peplink because Waveform and all the other ones do this as well. You know, here it tells you 7 dB of gain. It tells you that it has B71 support, which also means N71 support, and it says built for 5G. But let's get into exactly what does that mean for you as a consumer for this antenna. So the first thing here, we can look on the left, cellular frequencies. It tells you in the 600 to 1000 megahertz range, it has 0.3 dBi gain. So that's almost nothing, no gain. And now I think that includes the 6 feet of cabling that they have. So the antenna itself has higher gain, than you lose a little bit through the cables. But still, the point is, it doesn't really gain you anything out there. But that's where the antenna, key to it is that you can place it outside. So on this one, outside the RV or outside, you know, your Sprinter van with the metal shell that blocks a lot of the signal. So putting it outside, even though it's a very little gain, it still helps you with performance, because if you were inside your Sprinter van, you would lose signal due to the RV itself. But then up at the 5,000 to 6,000 megahertz range, it gets the 7 dB that they claim. But really, for our interest on T-Mobile, we're looking at that 1700 to 2700 range, so it's 5 dB. So if you were to ask for T-Mobile 5G ultra capacity, best case, this one is a 5 dB antenna. So now let's go down and look at that a little bit more details. Though this this data sheet also breaks down their different antennas, because they do have lots of different types of different connectors. Some of them have Wi-Fi, some of them don't. This helps decode that if you wanted to really dive into which one you wanted. But here I want to look at the cellular gain. So this is what is the data sheets I like, because it actually gives you a plot that shows you how the gain changes over frequency range. So here you can see a higher number is better, and 0 is 0 gain. So you can look down there at that 600, the 0.6 gigahertz is 600 megahertz. It has very little gain. You know, they advertise that 0.3. I see some stuff there as low as -4 dB gain, but that is below the 600 number. So it gets you a little bit, but it doesn't really start working until what's at about 1300 megahertz. That's where it really hops up, and then it starts to plateau at that 1600 to 2200 megahertz range. So that's really the 5G UC band for T-Mobile. So that's not bad. It's going to help you out there, but it's not tremendous. The other thing I wanted to show you real fast is the omnidirectional pattern. So this is the radiation pattern, and again, this stuff changes with the different frequencies. So you really got to dive into the details if you want to get nitty gritty. But in general, I'd call this shape a circle, right? It's not a perfect circle, but it's basically omnidirectional. Which way ever it faces, it's roughly the same amount of gain that it gets. So that's something important that we'll compare to the waveform one. All right, so here is the waveform data sheet. This is directly from their website. And here they advertise on the left there 3.5 to 8.5 dBi gain. So that's a little bit more truthful, because it does have a range, and they don't just claim it's 8.5. And then if we look here, this is where they break it down by frequency content. So again, in the 600 megahertz range, it's 4 dBi. In the 1700 to 2700, it's 8 dBi gain. And then, you know, so again, those are the different key frequencies I look at for T-Mobile. And then here's the directional pattern. So again, if you compare it to the Peplink that we just looked at, this one you can see it's a little bit lopsided. It's not really a circle anymore. It has more signal from the front side or the plastic side than it does on the metal side, or I think it's actually aluminum on the back side. And so that's where it's able to get the higher gain, because it's more directionally focused, but it's not some like laser pinpoint direction. It is sort of generalized out there. And then the graph they have is very detailed, and it really shows you how their gain changes by frequency. And this is where it's important for you to look in this chart and understand what signals you connect to and how much this antenna helps, because they have like log periodic directional antennas, which are kind of more like the triangle shape, and you can look and see you might actually benefit from a different antenna because of the specific bands you're trying to connect to. The next thing that they include here is the cable itself. So this is very important to understand, is that you don't just have to contend with your antenna, you have to contend with your cables and all your connectors. So this tells you here their standard kit has 30 feet. If you want different length, you can get it. And if you don't want the RS-240 grade, which is a good antenna cable, but it's not the top antenna cable. This one tells you the RF attenuation, so how much it loses over that length is 1.8 dB at the 600 megahertz, so you get more loss from a cable at the higher frequencies than the lower frequencies. Now I won't get into why, but and then at the 2500 megahertz range, which is really the peak for N41, that is a 3.9 dB gain. So before, if you looked at it, we had 8 dB of gain from the antenna, but we have 3.9 loss from the cable. So you're at like 4.1 dB of gain net after you have the cable. But there, again, you have the connectors. So if every connector you add can further hurt your signal. So I won't go into all the details, but no, here's this little pigtail. If you were to modify your T-Mobile gateway and put the pigtails on, you might lose up to 0.7 dB for that connector. So something to consider anytime you hook these up. You don't want to add connectors or cable length that you don't need. So that's the details. The T-Mobile one I don't have the details on. I could probably get it if I looked at SEC docs. All right, I want to make a few comments about build quality real fast because I think it's important to cover. And this is the waveform one. You can see this pipe is a large pipe. It's very thick. It has upturned flanges for strength. And here is the one that the no-name ones from Amazon give you. Obviously, it's a much smaller pipe diameter. It's thinner. And then all of the bracketry is weaker. So if I were to put this outside in the wind, I would be much more concerned that it would bend or break over time. But I actually have mine in the attic, so to be honest with you, mine's probably actually okay with the weaker stuff because it's not really exposed to any type of conditions or even elements. But, there is a quality difference there. The next one is looking at the ceiling. I've actually had users comment to me that their 4x4 was slowing down as a no-name brand, and they finally went up there to try to investigate what's going on, and they found it was half filled up with water. So all of these antennas have holes in the bottom of them, and even these no-name ones do for drainage, but insects clog them up, and if there's some kind of leak going in, it will start to fill up with water, and your signal will degrade over time. So if you look at the back side of them, they all have sealing. The waveform one looks really good, and it's a nice thick bead all the way across without any problems. If I look at the sealing on some of these other ones, it's a much worse quality sealing. It appears to be all sealed right now, but with weather checking or whatnot, you might run into problems there. So again, that's something to consider. If it's going to be outdoors, I would really hesitate a little bit with some of these from a build quality standpoint of they're not very sturdy. But if they're fast and you have it indoors, maybe it's going to be worthwhile. So let's see what it does. So I was down here and I was assembling these in the basement before going and putting them upstairs to do the testing. And I ran into my first problem. This one went together okay without a problem. But I was going to, this came shipped with the bolts threaded into here. I unthreaded them by hand. And then I put this together and I put it on. And I was going to put the bolt back in for the first time by hand. And this is what the bolt does. This is going through the capture nut that's inside the antenna. It kind of sticks somewhat, but then it just pulls out. It doesn't hold at all. So I was quite disappointed that I hadn't even used any kind of tool yet, and I've already stripped out the threads apparently. And then I went on to Amazon where I bought it to try to see if I could get a hold of the manufacturer to see if I could get something to happen. And I had to jump through hoops with the Amazon AI chat to get it to give me an answer that I could actually use instead of read some document. And the only recourse I had was to return the device and try to order another one. I couldn't contact the seller, and I went to the seller's page. There's no contact information, no phone number, any of that kind of stuff. So I was like, well, let me keep diving into it. And what I found is that it's hard to, you're not going to see it on the camera, but the threads on this screw are not rolled properly. And so they're not, the threads are not basically deep enough or big enough. So the bolt is basically undersized. And then the threaded insert that's attached in here is also poorly done. So it simply doesn't have enough engagement between the threads to work. Luckily, for the first time in probably 8 years, I will say I get to claim huge victory for keeping all my old bolts and storing them in the barn. And as I went out there and I found one that's the right size, it's maybe it's a 1/4 inch shorter or something. But this one, it's a good bolt. I haven't done anything to the antenna. This one now, it's a little bit loose, but it threads in and it holds. Again, I would really question if this would hold in the wind outside, but in my attic, I can thread this in and it holds. And so I have 2 of those. So that's my first experience that is bad. And that's what I'm going to say with Waveform and even Peplink to a certain extent. They have a phone number. They're in America. I can give them a call and say I'm having this problem, and they'll either know about it. Oh, we've had a couple customers have this, and let us send you either a new plate here, or let's send you some new hardware, and you can actually talk to them and get things fixed. So that's partly what you pay for, to be frank, when you buy like the Waveform stuff, is that kind of a level of support. So let's go put these in and see how they perform. Alright, so a quick note on the testing. This Chester Cheetah V2, it has the SDX, or the Snapdragon X65 modem chip in there. That's a new chip for you to be able to buy, at least in the retail market, to put in these hotspots. So that just came out, and that allows me to do more band aggregation than the older chips, the X62, X55, that the T-Mobile stock gateways have in them. So this lets me do some of that, and also lets me do a lot of band locking. So for the testing, I wanted to test out some typical 5G NSA bands. I wanted to test out N71 versus N41 and see how they compared. We talked about the antennas and how they should perform differently on different frequencies. And then this also allows me to go on to 5G SA, or 5G standalone, and I can combine 3 5G standalone signals into one strong connection here, and I wanted to see how that compares. So I'm able to use, that's why I really use this Chester Cheetah device, was because it allows me to pick which bands I want to do and do specific testing. So for all the testing, this was in that 3rd floor loft space, and unless it was just the stock unit as it sits right here with the these little paddle antennas, then I had the antennas hooked up to these back ports, and I've listed on the chart, but in general what the order that they should be in, if you pick the antenna left to right or right to left, either way, it doesn't really matter actually. And if you number those in chronological order, 1, 2, 3, 4, when you put them into here, it would be 1, 3, 2, 4. So you flip the 2 inner ones so that it's not chronological on this device. So that's the quick summary there. And then the antennas that have the short 6-foot lead, so that's the Peplink 40G and the T-Mobile branded small 4x4. That one, I actually moved this gateway into the attic because I mounted all of these antennas in the attic, in the trusses there. So they're actually a room away from the loft space that I would typically have this. But for that testing, I moved this into that attic space, so I did not have to add any extension onto those 6-foot cables. You can make a lot of comments about how I tested it. There's not really a fair way. The antennas I mounted and I put them all in the trusses. They're kind of side by side. I made sure I didn't have them in front of each other where they are blocking any signal. They're technically not in the exact same spot of each other, but they're all within 5 feet of each other. And then it is the same gateway and the same SIM card, so all of that is the same, and the test device, this tablet, is all the same between them. So I think it's fairly equal, but if you have any questions, put them in the comments below about what I tested or how I tested, or if you want to see something else, feel free to add that as well. So let's look at the data here. So here is the full Excel chart that is actually not even the full Excel chart. I scribbled. I have pages of notes here where I scribbled all my tests down on paper, as well as having the speedtest.net result. So I guess that's one thing to point out is I use speedtest.net app on this Android tablet to do all the speed testing. I picked the same test server every time, so at least that component is consistent there. And then what I did was, for a lot of these, I would test them multiple times, but I would only write down or record what I thought was a good test. So sometimes when you're switching different bands, or you're going from 5G SA to 5G NSA, it might take it a second for it to figure out which bands it wants to aggregate and connect to. So sometimes it figures that out when you run the speed test, and then it changes and you see it. And if that happens, I would rerun it. So they're not all, it's not like I did a pure scientific one where I ran 3 and then I took an average, and that's what I put here. It is a little bit more haphazard than that, but I feel fairly confident that these are representative of what you would get with this stuff. So let's go here to breaking down so we can try to digest. I realize that was a lot of data. You're not getting a lot out of that, but I'm going to break it down more and more granular to look at speed and latency here. So this chart here now is the 5G NSA, so 5G non-standalone, which is typical what something like T-Mobile connects with today on their gateways. And you can see in blue is the download speed, and that's on the left axis. So those numbers that go from 0 to 350 megabits per second is for that one. The orange is the upload, and it's a different axis, so it's a different scale, and that one goes from the 0 to 45 megabits per second. So I'm going to go to the next slide to get into more details, but you can see that there is a range, and I'll talk about what's causing this. Some of it is the antenna, but also some of it's my band and 5G modes that I'm changing here. All right, so if we hone in on just 5G SA, 5G standalone now, this is a much smaller subset of the data that's easier to digest. And again, we have blue for download, orange for upload, and you can see here that the Cheetah V2, which means this guy just as it sits with the pedal antennas, no external antenna, it got that 317 down and 6.6 upload. And then as soon as I hooked up the waveforms, I took off these paddles, I hooked up the waveform 4x4 with the waveform 30-foot cable. I didn't really get a big change in the download, but I got a very big change in the upload, where I went up to 32 megabits per second. Now I left the waveform cables on here, but I switched them on the antenna side to the square antenna. And when I did that, my download stayed the same. You know, granted they're a little bit faster, but I really call it the same. It's within the noise. But my uploads did suffer versus the waveform antenna. But I was actually fairly impressed that that square antenna performed as well as it did with the waveform cable set. So then my next plan was to go to the Amazon or the provided antenna cable that it came with, and sure enough, the speeds dropped drastically, and I would say pretty much they went right back to where the stock Chester Cheetah was with the paddle antennas. Now, you know, these are the components, the antenna versus the gateway were about 30 feet apart, and the stock gateway had to go through an extra wall or two inside the house to get to the tower. So if I were to move this Chester Cheetah out to where the antennas were, I guarantee you I would get the same speeds or better than that square bar that's shown at 340 and 6.9. So my summary there for this specific test is the square antenna setup with their provided cables that they gave you of 30 feet is no better than having a paddle antenna on your device and putting it in the same place. That's my summary from that. And it shows you that the waveform cable is a big factor in the performance. But we'll get into more examples where you can see even bigger differences between waveform and some of the other ones. So next, the rectangle one, and it was acting up on 5G SA, and that's why I have that call out there, meaning that it was connecting to 5G SA, and it was flipping between a couple different bands. So it's like it couldn't quite decide or stay connected, and I don't know if that was some noise going on or something, but I did get a couple speed tests. They are pretty erratic, and this 152 and 12 was what I thought was a representative test for that one. Then I went to the Peplink 40G, and that one got 260 and then 14. So, worse performance than the stock one for download, but it did help with upload some. And then when I went to the T-Mobile 4x4 little one, it actually would not connect to 5G SA at all, no matter what I did. So it actually stuck on 4G LTE, had no 5G connection at all. And when I did that, I did get a upload improvement actually, but the download drastically suffered. So that was the summary there for 5G SA. For speed, now let's look at latency. So latency, now we have a couple things. One, we have the idle in orange, and that one is on the left axis. So those ones are almost identical. They range from 17 milliseconds to 22 milliseconds. So within 5 milliseconds of each other, I would call that a tie. Quite frankly, they really don't. They're not always that consistent. I can see that kind of change test to test. So then we go to the blue, which is download, and this is a test that while it's downloading data, it's pinging and seeing how long it takes to ping when you're downloading or moving traffic, and it takes longer typically when you do that. But that's where you'll experience lag in video calls or gaming and whatnot. You want the loaded ping, which is what this blue and gray are, to be as close to your idle ping as you can get. But so here, it's a little bit inconclusive. I would say, if you go from the first column of the Chester V2 stock into the 4x4 from Waveform, you do see a drop in the download and especially the upload ping. But then if you go further to the far right, where I basically tested the waveform in the same case again, and this was actually at the end of all my testing, I retest the baseline configuration so I make sure I don't have a big change in my performance. It's actually not as big of a change. It's basically the same for download loaded. It is quicker for the upload loaded still at the end, but the only real outlier I would say is the rectangle one was actually performing some of the best for especially the download loaded ping. But again, on that one, it was acting up, and so I don't even know exactly what band it was on for sure when it was doing this. So, long story short, I don't really see a huge thing that I can claim on the 5G SA from a latency standpoint. Alright, so now we have the N71 5G non-standalone. So this is their 5G extended network. It's the 600 give or take megahertz range. And I wanted to test that one specifically. So I locked it to N71, did not allow it to go to N41 or N25 on the 5G network. I let it pick its own 4G primary band, which is the anchor for the non-standalone case. And then we ran this test. Now, I did actually forget to do it with the Chester Cheetah stocks, so I don't have that baseline. But on the far right is the waveform 4x4 hooked up to this. And you can see that it's 111 for download and 41 for upload. I'm working now backwards from the right to left. If I go to the Peplink 40G, I was actually very impressed that it actually maintained that same upload capability, but it could not handle the N71 for download. And if you remember what we talked about, that Peplink 40G had very poor gain at that N71 frequency. So I was not surprised to see the download hurt, and in this case with N71, I think the upload actually occurs over the 4G, so that kind of makes sense that it can perform poorly on download, but actually good on upload based on which one it's connected to. Now, a sort of similar story there on the rectangle one. It did decent for the upload capability, but again was really struggling for download. And I had two of them on the rectangle, and if I look up higher, it looks like one time the anchor was just B2, the other time it was B66 and B2, so it had two 4Gs one time, and that's what looks like actually hurt it. When it actually connected to B66, it actually slowed down for the download at least, but it did help it with the upload. So now on the far left, the square one did the best overall compared, second place to waveform, and it's a little bit worse for upload, and it is worse for download than the waveform one, but still better than the other antennas out here. So On this one, I would rate waveform as number one, and then the square one as a second place runner-up. Okay, now if we look at this same setup, but now just paying attention to latency or ping, this one we can see, again I'm starting on the right side, that we have the waveform 4x4, and its idle ping is 32, which was the fastest of all of them. But the 371 download loaded ping was actually slower than the Peplink one. And then the upload loaded ping at 147 was slower than the Peplink and the Square one actually, but not by a huge margin. And so again here the Peplink 40G does good for ping. And then the Rectangle did okay for ping when it was on just the, when it was on B2 and B66 bands, but when it dropped off of the B66 band, or before it actually connected to it, because of the chronological order there, then it actually had a very poor download loaded ping that's actually literally off the chart here at 1366 milliseconds. And then the Square one also was struggling for the download loaded ping, where it was up there and it was high, but it did good for the upload side. All right, so now we are looking at N41 and the associated bands of B66 and B2. So I had a lot of data on those, so I wanted to just kind of summarize all those, because I think I had a test for all of the different antennas that had B66, B2, and N41 as their bands are connected to. So starting on the left side, we have the Chester Cheetah V2 stock, and that was at 209 for download and 7.7 megabits per second for upload. As soon as I hooked up the waveform 4x4, it jumped up to 284, which I would say is significant change there, and then 27 megabits per second for upload. So again, a big change there for upload. Once I switched to the square antenna, but I kept the waveform cable, my speeds dropped. So I think this is probably one of my clearest indicators of, here you go from a waveform antenna with a waveform cable to a square Amazon antenna with a waveform cable, and then you go to the square antenna with a Amazon cable. And so when we did this here, we can see that as soon as we went to the square antenna, we dropped both download speed and upload speed, even though we still had the waveform cable. And then once we further took away the waveform products and went all to Amazon products on that fourth item that just says square, that one got 171 for download and 18 for upload. So if you look at that compared to just the Chester Cheetah by itself, it's actually slower for download. Now it did help the upload a lot, but you lose a lot of the benefits of the antenna once you go to just the straight Amazon products there versus the waveform product. Now if we go to the Rectangle antenna, funny enough, it got the exact same download speed as the waveform setup, but the upload was no better than the Chester Cheetah by itself. So you really weren't seeing the benefit of that antenna for the upload capability. So for the Peplink one, you can see it got 181 for download, so slower than the stock Chester Cheetah, but it did help the upload a lot by going up to 21. So it actually did better than both the square and the rectangle, much larger antenna. So I was pretty surprised by that. But again, if you look at it compared to just the stock unit, you're only really gaining upload capability there. So still, I would say I've been pretty impressed with the Peplink one so far. So the T-Mobile 4x4, it drastically hurt our download capability, but it did help somewhat with our upload, but really not worth it from what I can see so far. All right, and then the other waveform 4x4 at the end, that's actually me testing this. All this testing took about 2 hours for me up in the attic space, which is more time than I wanted to spend in the attic. But this just shows that my speed pretty much stayed the same as it did at the beginning of the test. My download got a little bit slower, my upload got a little bit faster, but overall my story stays the same there, that I didn't see a huge change in my ISP speed. Alright, so now looking at latency comparison. Now for this one I threw in all of the N41 connections that I had across the board, and then what I try to do to highlight this a little bit is in red down below. What I'm trying to show is any of them that I would say are significantly slower than the stock Chester Cheetah unit, I marked it as red. And so what's funny, of course, is that the second one in is the Chester Cheetah itself. I marked it red, and it's because you can see clearly there the even the idle ping is kind of higher than the norm, and the upload ping went up to 814 milliseconds. So, sometimes that happens. I thought about excluding that data, but just for full transparency, I put it in there. You do get spikes sometimes in it, and I just wanted to be transparent that that happens time to time. So next one I marked was the square with the waveform. And again, this one you could compare it to one right beside it, and that was a better performance. It still looks like it was kind of consistently slow on the upload loaded ping, so that's why I went ahead and marked it, because it went up to the 676. And that's kind of the same story there later. It did it again without the waveform cable as well. And then the rectangle kind of always performed poorly there on the download loaded. So I saw some consistency there, and like I said, I did more tests than this, that they did not seem to be consistently good with the ping performance as I would like to have seen them. Especially if you go and look at the waveform 4x4 ones, there you can see a good drop in the ping performance. Although I did get a little bit of a high one there towards the end, where the download loaded ping was being a little bit on the higher side than I would prefer. The other thing I wanted to point out on this is the Peplink 40G. Again, tends to perform well for ping. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing there. Typically, from what I've seen, is when I get the signal to noise ratio the best it can be, that really helps my ping performance. And that's where I see typically a ping performance when I go from the stock antennas to an external antenna with a bigger antenna to grab and separate signal and noise from each other. Alright, now I said all that about the ping being bad, but I wanted to show this one to put everything in perspective. This is the same chart as before, but I had to zoom out because I included the Sagemcom 5688W, which is the stock T-Mobile gateway, the one of the black towers. And I had that up there, and I tested it directly connected to it using its own internal antennas. And you can see there that I got 65 milliseconds for the idle ping, and I got 916 for download and 773 for upload. So it almost was worse than everything else out there. The only thing that did a worse job than it was the T-Mobile 4x4 external antenna, which I found quite humorous myself. So maybe not everyone thinks that's so funny. But that is also one of the big things why I go to something like a third-party gateway, is to help with that ping. And then when I go to external antennas, they further help, so long as you get a good quality product there. Okay, so that's really the summary of the information. I'm going to leave this chart up here for a little bit so you guys can pause the video and you can look at it if you really want to digest it some more and make your own conclusions out of it. And then if you have questions about what I did, what your thoughts are, about how I tested it, or if I should test something differently, please do it. The reason I did this is really because of viewers like you messaged me, put comments in, and so I could tell enough of you guys were like, hey, Nate, you're only covering waveform, we want something else. I said, fine, I'll go do something else. But from what I saw before with the quality of them and what I saw other users do, I did not have a lot of faith that I would get the same performance out of these other ones, these cheaper products, than the waveform one. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it looks like that held true, and the waveform one does outperform those other ones. And so I'm always one to get bargains or get a better deal if you can make it work. But I have learned there are times when you do get what you pay for. And, in this case, I do think that is really what's holding true here. Now, you can buy something like the waveform cable itself, which, I did see that as a significant factor in some of this stuff. But I think the quad cables, so the four cables together that you need for the 4x4, for a 30-foot run, I think it's like $150 or even more dollars to get that. And so by the time you stack that on to any other 4x4 antenna that cost, $150 or something like that, you are pretty much approaching the cost of the kit from waveform itself. So I think it's expensive for the kit, but if you use the Nader Tater 5% off coupon code, then it takes a little bit of sting off of it, and before you know it, you'll be having much faster internet at home or on the road, wherever you're at, and you'll be a happy camper.